Okay, so we're talking about the halachas of edus. Not that we've seen a tremendous practical issue from this, but the halacha basically has taught us up until now that if you know testimony that can help your friend in Beis Din, then you have an obligation to testify. What do the words mean, v'ro'i laha'ido, that you're capable of testifying for him? You have to be capable. So what does that mean? Lafuke karov apostle. This is to exclude someone who's a relative. If you're a relative and you know testimony, so then that's not going to help.
Rabbi, could you share the screen?
Sorry. Yeah. Always forget something. Yeah, there you go. Okay, yeah. I'm at that age. What can I tell you? Okay. The chol edus, and also if a person is puzzle for edus, a person could otherwise be puzzle for edus. Let's say he's a professional gambler, and we'll talk about what things disqualify you for edus. The chol edus sheyesh la'adam hana'a ba'pasal lahaid. Anytime that there's a personal benefit to be gained by testifying on someone's behalf in Beis Din, then you are puzzled to be a witness. And I refer you there. There are many details to this halacha. That as far as whether or not a person is kosher to be a witness, whether he's a party of interest, whether he's disqualified because of any prejudice, is something that the judge himself will have to make a determination. Sheyavin ikar hamishpatim b'yeda davar hagorim ladavar acher, that a judge has to be able to know the law. He has to know human nature. He has to know what's going to cause something else. V'yamik liros im yimtza lazeha eitzad hana be'eduzu, and he has to be able to penetrate into the matter to determine whether a witness could benefit in some way. Afilu b'derech rechoka v'nifla'a hareze lo ya'id ba. Even if it's far-fetched that this witness could potentially benefit, that would be still a reason to disqualify him. And also a judge has to know how to recuse himself. Now that's a huge issue. And unfortunately, that's also been a big problem in Batei Din, in local communities, is that there are many times when I've personally had an experience where a judge should have recused himself, did not, and it becomes quite problematic. Recuse, to take yourself out, So that means.
How could you not take yourself out if you say something?
Well, if the Rav says, don't worry, I'm not gay of the dover. So, and if your friend can potentially benefit from your testimony, so there are situations where a person did not see the actual transactional loan. He didn't see the cash transfer hands from the lender to the borrower, for example. But the borrower said, "Oh, I borrowed money from Yankel," okay, and he says it let's say at a kiddush on Shabbos. I borrowed $1,000 from Yankel, but he never designated the people at the kiddush as his witnesses. So they, just because a guy says I borrowed money from Yankel at a kiddush doesn't mean that they are reliable witnesses. The Yachal Halolomar Shalo Lahashbias Atzmo Kivein, Pire Shalo Laharos Lahazbia es Atzmo Kivein, Per Shalo Laharos Saveya Ve'ashir. Because the person who said that could give an excuse to Beis Din. He says, I didn't mean to say literally that I borrowed money from Yankel. I just noticed that everyone was talking about my new car. And I was worried that people are going to think that I'm a wealthy guy because I just got a Lexus or an Acura or whatever. And I didn't want people to think that I'm a wealthy guy. So I said, no, I borrowed the money from Yaakov. So sometimes people will make up stories at a Kiddush, especially. You should hear some of the stories that I hear at Kiddush, right? People will make up stories in order to deflect from themselves certain truths that they would prefer not to be made known publicly about their, let's say, financial status. And so just because a person says something in a casual setting does not mean that you now can testify about them that this is something that they meant seriously. Yesh omrim de toeles hainu dafka toeles mamon, aval edus ketatos umeribos ubiushin v'cherufin de inkam toeles mamon eno chayv lahayid lo afimit ve'eno bebeistin v'tzarech iyan. So there's another issue of clarification that the poskim discuss, is that when we say that there's a v'yesh lechaveru toeles, that there's a benefit in my testifying because I actually know the facts, right? So one thing that we clarified is that you have to know the facts clearly because you've seen the transaction, but not just because you heard about it or whatever, right? So that's number one. Number two is it has to be you have to know the nature of the case. The only time when there's a real benefit where you're obligated to testify is when there's a financial stake involved. So, for example, Ruvain says to you, Shimon owes me money. You know he owes me money. I need you to testify for me in Beis Din. So there you have an obligation to do so. But what if Ruvain comes to you and says, this is not about money, but Shimon disgraced my honor. He called my wife a very not nice name. But I want to take him to Beis Din. You have this situation. I've had people come over to me and say, so and so insulted me publicly, and I want to take him to Beis Din. Okay, lots of luck with that, my friend. In other words, usually Beis Din is not going to hear cases like that. Can I tell people, well, what are you trying to gain by taking him to Beis Din? Well, you can't get away with that. Well, unfortunately, he can, because in the world that we live in, sometimes you have to live with people saying things against you that aren't true and public embarrassment and things like that. But there are certain situations where in the old days, if a person publicly disgraced you or slandered against you, you could take that person to Beis Din. And the Beis Din could administer a penalty or a fine against that person. So there is an opinion that says that if a person wants to take his friend to Beis Din for non-financial matters, they get into an argument, or one has insulted the other or shamed the other, and there's no financial stake involved. So some opinions say that you're not obligated to go to Beis Din even if your friend asks you to testify, right? But it's not clear. He says v'tzarech iyun. Apparently, there's a whole discussion. Okay, so let's continue on in the Imrei Yaakov. So chayev lahayid lo. You're obligated to testify when you can help someone recoup their losses. Kid'chsiv, v'hu aid, o ra'a o yada im lo yagid v'nasav v'no. The Torah says in Sefer Vayikra that if you're a witness, you've seen it or you know about it, if you do not testify, you shall bear your sin. V'imheyid kayim, v'imheyid kiyei mitzvah saseh deoraisa. And when you do testify, you fulfill a mitzvah deoraisa. B'makom she'agilo b'seida b'im yayid ena mechuyev lahayid dumya dechiyuv hashavas haveda. He says, let's say you're going to incur a financial loss by going to testify. Guy says, I want you to testify on my behalf. So you say to him, but one second, the Beis Din is all the way in New York. I'm going to have to travel. I'm going to have to take off of work. You willing to compensate me for my time off? He says, no, I don't have the money. Well, I'm not obligated to testify for you if I have to incur financial loss. And this is the same thing that we saw by the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. I'm not obligated to do the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda if I'm going to incur personal financial loss. But once you've arrived, in other words, once you're at the Beis Din, even if you're going to incur financial loss by testifying, you have an obligation to testify. You're no longer at that point. In other words, potentially, by my testimony, I could incur financial loss. Let's say perhaps if I testify against the other guy, he's going to stop giving me business. So that's not enough of a reason to not testify. It's only if, right, I incur loss. Well, we'll have to see how far this extends. It's a bit ambiguous, but he says once you've arrived at Beis Din, you have to testify. You're not allowed to say I don't know, even if it means you could lose money by giving your testimony.
Before you show yourself?
Well, that's a good question. We haven't gotten to that point yet, as far as what kind of how much detail do you need to know in order to testify. But certainly you need to have seen it yourself. You can't just say, I heard people talking, just like we saw the previous halach.
If it's a relative or a family member, and then you have to testify against
No,
them.
you can't. You're even if you're testifying against, you're disqualified. Right, because sometimes family members want to get back at each other. Yeah.
So what about which place for some reason is delayed, and now you're suffering financial loss? Let's say that it's delayed by 24 hours.
You have to, it's fair for you to say to a guy,
Should you give leave?
Yeah, you can tell the person you have to either pay me or I'm going to have to leave. Yeah.
So when you pay a witness for the expense, it's a very thin line, because you can
it's a question of
private. Which hotel you're staying, first class. It's like, okay, so now you are like having a all in.
Yeah, it's a valid point. How far does this extend? Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, the Beis Din. The midichsiv, you have to testify for him in Beis Din. The midichsiv im lo yagid v'nasa'ovano, because the words in the pasuk say, if you do not inform, then you will bear your sin. That's what the pasuk says. B'darshinan kevin shehigid she'enu yodea lo edus shuv enu chozer umagid v'hainu dafka b'Beis Din. And the Gemara learns from there is that once you inform the Beis Din that you don't know testimony, then you cannot change your mind and then give testimony afterwards. So basically, what he's saying is all of these halachos have to do with testifying in Beis Din. So because these are technical laws that are pertinent only to a Beis Din. And im yitva'enu sheyoid lo, that you only are obligated once the person subpoenas you, I guess, or summons you to testify on his behalf. Mashma de belit tvia eno chayav leilech lahaid. It sounds from this language that if a person does not summon you, then you're not obligated to testify. Aval kasha, the harei yesh bazeh mishum lo saman l'dam re'echa. He says, but that's problematic to come to that conclusion based on this language, because we know that there's a halach in the Torah of do not stand idly by your brother's blood, lo samad al dam re'echa, which means that kol sheyodei lo zchus v'hu matzud al yedei miniyaso lo ha'idlo, that if you know testimony, maybe this guy doesn't even know that you were a witness to the transaction. Maybe he doesn't even know that you exist, but you happen to have seen it. What? So just because he didn't summon you, because he's not aware that you can testify on his behalf, you're exempt from testimony? What about the law that you shall not stand idly by when your friend is suffering or losing? And what about the mitzvah of returning lost items? where even if the person is not aware that you can help them, you have an obligation to help them. Uve'erech shai tiretz dahad etzarach litzvoa so ein zarak mishum demistama yodei habaldin mihem edav. He says, so one of the commentaries, the Erech Shai, I'm not familiar with that sefer, he says that when the halacha states that you're only obligated to testify when you are summoned to testify, is talking about a standard case, because we assume that most people know who can testify on their behalf. And therefore, if your friend who knows that you saw what happened, but does not summon you to Beis Din, you can assume he has forgiven or basically has foregone the need for you to testify. He's basically saying, it's okay, I got this covered. I have other witnesses. I don't need you. But if the person going to court who's trying to get his money that is not even aware that you can help him, then you certainly have an obligation to go and volunteer your services to testify on his behalf. Uveshar Mishpat Piresh, the Mashakos of Rambam, Behushi Yitve'enu Shiyoidlo. Now remember, this is the language of the Rambam. The Rambam says that you're only obligated to go when you are summoned. He says, so this Sefer Shar Mishpat writes that when the Rambam uses that language, Hainu la'afuki kish adam yodeya edus lachavero v'habal davar adayin ein donin zeim zeh. He says that the Rambam is referring to a case where I've seen how Shimon owes Ruvain money, but Ruvain has not yet taken Shimon to court. Or Ruvain knows that Shimon owes him money, but he hasn't yet come to the realization that he can win the case based on my testimony. He says, then, since they haven't yet started the adjudication, then this person is not obligated to go to Beis Din to testify. But if they've already started the adjudication, Reuven is suing Shimon to be able to recoup his losses. And Reuven is completely unaware that Levi can help him win his case. And I see that Reuven doesn't know that I can help him, then I certainly have an obligation. Then I'm certainly obligated to go and testify on his behalf. So, just to clarify, when the halacha states, and the Rambam's quoting the Rambam's language, that once you are summoned, you are obligated to testify, this does not mean that I can exempt myself as long as he doesn't summon me if he's not aware that I can help him. It's only talking about a case where either the adjudication hasn't yet begun in Beis Din, or he knows that I can testify on his behalf and he hasn't summoned me. Then I'm allowed to assume that he has someone else that will help him. He doesn't need my testimony. There are a lot of times where you might tell someone, you need me to come to Beis Din to support you, to testify on behalf of the Beis Din. And it turns out that he's got a bunch of people that could testify on his behalf, that he is the prevailing party. So you don't have to insert yourself unless you're summoned in those situations. Okay. All right. Well, not necessarily, but it could be you're aware. The guy has told at Kiddush, I'm taking Yankel to Beis Din because he owes me money, and you all know what happened. You were all there. I'll let you know if I need you. And so, and he hasn't. Yeah.